Picture this. You are a Mongol heavy lancer, a man who has forgotten what it feels like to be afraid. You are part of the most terrifying military machine the world has ever seen, a ghost riding a horse, bred for endurance and slaughter. For 3 years, you have ridden across 5,000 miles of unknown territory, burning cities whose names you cannot pronounce, and breaking armies 10 times your size. You are invincible. You are the wrath of God, but right now, sitting in your saddle deep within the dense forests of the Volga region, you feel something you haven't felt since you were a child. You feel small. The trees here are not like the open grass of the steppe. They are thick, ancient, and suffocating. They block out the sun, and more importantly, they block your line of sight. You are following a retreating enemy, a group of Volga Bulgars who have been running from you for days. It feels like another easy hunt. But then the air changes, the birds stop singing. Stop. The retreating Bulgars suddenly stop running and turn around. They aren't panicking, they are smiling. You look to your left and right, expecting to see your flanks, but all you see are trees. And then the trees start to move. Thousands of men rise from the undergrowth, their armor painted to match the leaves, their eyes locked on your throat. The trap doesn't snap shut with a roar, it snaps shut with the wet thud of arrows hitting flesh. You reach for your bow, but the branches are too low. You try to turn your horse, but the mud grips its hooves like a vice. For the first time in history, the predator has walked willingly into the mouth of the prey. This is the Battle of Samara Bend, the day the invincible Mongol horde was not just defeated, but hunted down like animals. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer magnitude of this disaster, you have to understand the monsters who walked into it. The year is 1223. The Mongol Empire is still in its youth, a ravenous, expanding beast that has just begun to taste the blood of the West. The men leading this expedition are not normal generals, they are Subutai and Jebe. In the history of warfare, there are conquerors, and then there are forces of nature. Subutai is the latter. He is a man who views cities not as centers of civilization, but as obstacles to be leveled. He views populations not as people, but as statistics to be erased. Subutai and Jebe have been on what history calls the Great Raid. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. Genghis Khan sent them to scout the lands west of the Caspian Sea to see what was out there. A normal general would have taken a few hundred men, looked at the maps, and reported back. Subutai took 20,000 horsemen and decided to destroy everything in his path just to see if he could. They smashed the kingdom of Georgia. They crossed the Caucasus mountains in winter, a feat that was physically impossible. And just weeks before this moment in the forest, they annihilated a massive coalition of Rus princes at the Battle of the Kalka River. They are currently riding north along the Volga River, heading back to Mongolia. They are heavy with gold, slaves, and arrogance. They believe they have cleared the map. They believe there is no one left in this corner of the world stupid enough to challenge them. But they are wrong. While Subutai was celebrating his victory over the Rus, a king named Gabdullah Chelbir was watching him. Chelbir rules the Volga Bulgaria, a wealthy trading empire that controls the river traffic. He isn't a feudal knight bound by honor, and he isn't a disorganized tribal chief. He is a calculator. He has been studying the Mongol tactics. He knows they are coming. And unlike every other ruler who tried to meet the Mongols on the open field, Chelbe has prepared a welcome gift that defies the conventions of honorable warfare. He isn't building a wall to keep them out. He is opening the door to let them in. To understand why the Mongols walked into a trap, you first have to understand why they believed they were untouchable. It wasn't just ego, it was track record. The two men leading this army, Subutai and Jebe, were not born into royalty. In the Mongol meritocracy, blood meant nothing, results meant everything. Genghis Khan called them his dogs of war. He said they had foreheads of brass, jaws like scissors, and tongues like piercing daggers. They were fed on human flesh and driven by an insatiable hunger for conquest. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were accurate job descriptions. Subutai, in particular, was a terrifying anomaly. In a culture that worshipped the horse and the bow, he was often too heavy to ride a single pony for long distances. He was a brilliant, overweight tactician who viewed war as a mathematical equation where the variables were terror, speed, and starvation. He didn't just want to defeat you, he wanted to break your psychological capacity to resist. Jebe was his perfect counterweight, the arrow, a man who had once shot Genghis Khan in the neck during a battle, survived the executioner, and joined the Khan to become his greatest cavalry commander. Together, they were a two-headed monster that had spent 3 years tearing the throat out of the Western world. This campaign, the Great Raid of 1220 to 1223, remains one of the most insane military feats in human history. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance mission. Imagine sending a scout to check the perimeter, and that scout decides to burn down 3 neighboring countries just to see if matches work. That is what Subutai and Jebe did. They destroyed the kingdom of Georgia, humiliated the Cumans, and crossed the Caucasus mountains in conditions that would freeze a modern army to death. By the time they reached the steppes of what is now Ukraine, they were undefeated gods of war. But the moment that sealed their fate, the moment that inflated their arrogance to the bursting point, happened just weeks before they reached the Volga. It was the Battle of the Kalka River. There they faced a coalition of Rus princes, the flower of Eastern European chivalry. The Rus had heavy armor and numbers and the home field advantage. Subutai destroyed them with a maneuver that would become his signature, the feigned retreat. The Mongols pretended to run away for 9 days. 9 days of fake panic, luring the Rus army into a disorganized, exhausted line. Then Subutai turned the horses around. The slaughter was absolute, but it was what happened after the battle that defined the Mongol mindset. The captured Rus princes weren't just executed, they were used as furniture. The Mongols laid wooden planks over the living bodies of the defeated generals and held a victory feast on top of them. As Subutai and Jebe drank fermented mare's milk and celebrated, the sounds of crushing bones and suffocating men provided the background music. This is the level of psychological dominance they possessed. They didn't just kill their enemies, they literally partied on top of them. So when they turned their horses northeast toward the Volga, Bulgaria, they were drunk on invincibility. They had just crushed the armies of Europe. They had traversed 4,000 miles of hostile territory without a single loss. In their minds, the world was flat, and they were the hammer that flattened it. They looked at the map and saw the Volga Bulgars not as a threat, but as a toll booth. They assumed these river people would either bow down or die like the Rus. They assumed the feigned retreat was an unstoppable magic trick that no one could solve. Subutai, usually the master of spies, became lazy. He didn't account for the fact that news travels upriver. He didn't realize that while he was feasting on the Rus princes, survivors were fleeing north, whispering stories of the devil horseman to anyone who would listen. The element of surprise, usually the Mongols' greatest weapon, was gone. The Volga Bulgars knew exactly who was coming. They knew about the arrows, they knew about the speed, and most importantly, they knew about the feigned retreat. And while Subutai was riding north, dreaming of his return to Mongolia and the glory that awaited him, the Bulgars were sharpening their axes and waiting in the silence of the Samara Bend. The dogs of war were about to find out that in the dense forests of the Volga, they were not the only ones with teeth. Who were the people foolish enough or brilliant enough to stand their ground against the Mongol apocalypse? If you look at a modern map, you won't find Volga Bulgaria. It has been erased, buried under layers of Russian expansion and centuries of forgetting. But in 1223, this was not some backwater tribe of savages living in mud huts. It was a mercantile superpower. The Volga Bulgars were the gatekeepers of the north, the middlemen who connected the freezing forests of Scandinavia to the burning sands of the Islamic Caliphate. They didn't just trade in honey and wax, they traded in information. They sat on the Volga River like a spider sits on a web, feeling the vibrations of the world around them. While Subutai was busy burning Georgia and crushing the Rus, the Bulgars were listening. They heard the stories of the horsemen who drank blood and never slept. But unlike the Europeans who viewed the Mongols as a biblical punishment from God that could only be prayed away, the Volga Bulgars viewed them as a tactical problem that could be solved. And the man tasked with solving that problem was Abdullah Chelbe. History doesn't give us many paintings of Chelbe. We don't have long speeches recorded by fawning scribes, but his actions paint a portrait of a man who possessed a terrifying level of cold pragmatism. He was a ruler who understood that against an enemy like Subutai, bravery was a death sentence. You don't fight a hurricane, you let it blow itself out. Chelbe knew that his heavy cavalry, while formidable, was slower than the Mongols. He knew that in an open field, his archers would be outranged. He looked at the data and he realized that if he fought the Mongols on their terms, on the open ground, his civilization would end in an afternoon. So he decided to change the terms. Chelbe knew the geography of his homeland better than he knew the lines on his own palm. The Volga region is not the infinite, flat, grassy ocean of the steppe. It is a place where the earth buckles and twists. It is a land of dense, ancient forests where the undergrowth is so thick it can hide 1,000 men just 10 feet from the road. It is a network of rivers that turn the ground into a muddy soup capable of swallowing a horse to its knees. This was terrain that neutralized speed. It suffocated mobility. It was the anti-steppe. Subutai's greatest weapon was his ability to maneuver, to fan out, encircle, and swarm. But you cannot swarm if the trees force you into a single, narrow column. You cannot encircle if there is a river on one side and a wall of timber on the other. Chelbe realized that the Mongols were essentially a high-speed projectile. To stop them, he didn't need to be faster. He just needed to be the wall they slammed into. He began to mobilize his people, but not for a glorious last stand on the walls of his capital. That is what the Khwarezmians did, and they died. That is what the Rus did, and they died. Instead, Chelbe ordered a different kind of preparation. He evacuated the villages along the southern border. He hid the livestock. He silenced the land. He wanted the Mongols to enter a ghost world, to feel that eerie confidence that comes when you think the enemy has fled in terror. He baited the hook with the one thing Subutai couldn't resist, the illusion of an easy conquest. Chelbe wasn't just preparing an army, he was constructing a killbox, reverse engineering the very tactics the Mongols had used to destroy the world, and preparing to feed them a taste of their own medicine. Abdullah Chelbe understood a fundamental truth about warfare that most European kings ignored. You cannot beat the Mongols by being stronger than them. You can only beat them by being smarter than them. He knew that Subutai's entire military philosophy relied on a specific psychological trigger. The Mongols would attack, pretend to panic, and run away. The enemy, drunk on the sudden rush of victory, would break formation to chase them. Then the Mongols would turn around and slaughter the disorganized mob. It was the oldest trick in the book, yet it worked every single time because it exploited the universal human defect of greed. So, Chelbeer decided to do something audacious. He decided to use the feigned retreat against the masters of the feigned retreat. He would not meet them at the border. He would not harass their supply lines. He would create a vacuum. He ordered his forward units to engage the Mongol vanguard and then run for their lives. But this fleeing army wasn't running in a panic. They were running along a specifically demarcated path like rats in a maze, leading the Mongols toward the Samara Bend. The Samara Bend is a geographical anomaly where the Volga River takes a massive, sharp detour, creating a peninsula that is surrounded by water on 3 sides. Inside this loop lies the Zhiguli Mountains, a rugged, heavily forested terrain that is a nightmare for cavalry. On the open steppe, a Mongol horseman is a fighter jet. In the dense woods of the Zhiguli, he is just a guy sitting on a pony, dodging low-hanging branches, unable to see more than 20 feet in front of him. Chelbeer turned this geography into a weapon. Deep inside this forest, Chelbeer began to construct the Forgotten Wall. This wasn't a stone fortress meant to withstand a siege, it was a kill zone. His men worked in silence, felling thousands of trees to build 2 massive parallel palisades. These weren't just walls, they were a funnel. He disguised these fortifications with foliage and mud, blending them into the natural tree line. He wasn't building a castle, he was building a chute. The plan was to lure the Mongols into this narrow corridor where their numbers would mean nothing. But the genius of the plan wasn't the wall itself, it was the psychological bait. Chelbeer knew that Subutai was currently suffering from what we might call victory disease. Subutai had just destroyed the combined might of the Rus principalities. He felt untouchable. If a small Bulgar force appeared and then ran away, Subutai wouldn't suspect a trap. He would just assume that the Bulgars were terrified of him. Why wouldn't they be? Everyone else was. Chelbeer was banking on Subutai's narcissism. He was betting the survival of his entire kingdom on the hope that the great Mongol general was too arrogant to look down at the mud and see the tracks of a trap. The Bulgar army was split into 2 distinct groups. The first group was the bait, light cavalry and mobile infantry, whose only job was to be seen, to look pathetic, and to run. The second group was the hammer. These were the heavy infantry and archers, thousands of them, hidden behind the camouflaged earthworks, ordered to remain perfectly silent. No fires, no talking, just waiting in the damp shadows of the forest. Chelbeer was essentially setting up a massive claymore mine, and he was waiting for Subutai to trip the wire. It is a terrifying thing to invite a monster into your home. Most leaders would have tried to negotiate or pay tribute, but Chelbeer understood that you cannot negotiate with a wildfire. You have to starve it of oxygen. And as the Mongol scouts reported a weak and fleeing enemy force ahead, the trap was set. The stage was prepared for one of the greatest reversals in military history. The predator was licking its lips, completely unaware that it was about to walk into a room with no exits. The march into the Volga territory wasn't a battle, it was a parade. Or at least, that is what it looked like to the Mongols. As Subutai and Jebe pushed their army deeper into the Bulgar lands, they found exactly what they expected to find. Nothing. The villages were empty, the fires were cold, the livestock was gone. To a novice commander, total silence is suspicious. To a commander drunk on his own legend, silence just sounds like submission. Subutai looked at the abandoned huts and didn't see a tactical withdrawal. He saw a population that had already accepted its fate. This is the moment where the history of the world pivots. If you want to understand the genius of Subutai, the man who would later dismantle Hungary and Poland with surgical precision, you have to look at this moment of absolute failure. Fast forward 18 years to the Battle of Mohi in 1241. There, Subutai would spend days scouting a single bridge, obsessing over every tree line, refusing to move until he knew the location of every enemy soldier. He was paranoid, methodical, and slow. But in 1223 at the Samara Bend, that man did not exist yet. The Subutai of 1223 was a gambler who had never lost a hand. He didn't send scouts deep into the Zhiguli Mountains. He didn't secure his flanks. He simply kicked his horse and rode forward, assuming the enemy would break before he even drew his sword. The Bulgar light cavalry played their role to perfection. They appeared on the horizon, silhouettes against the grey sky, just close enough to be seen, but too far to be engaged. They would fire a few token arrows, weak, inaccurate shots, and then turn and flee in seemingly chaotic terror. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. They were dragging the Mongol column out, stretching it thin, pulling it away from the open plains and into the tightening noose of the river bend. And the terrain was changing. The Mongols didn't notice it at first, but the world was closing in on them. The infinite horizon of the steppe, where a man can see for 20 miles, was gone. The Volga River began to curl around them like a snake coiling around a rat. The ground became uneven, broken by ravines and thickets of oak and lime trees. The massive, thundering formations of Mongol heavy cavalry were forced to squeeze into narrower and narrower columns. Their greatest strength, mobility, was being stripped away mile by mile. But the Mongols didn't stop. Why would they? They were the apex predators of the 13th century. They had hunted armies in the deserts of Khwarezm and the snows of Georgia. They didn't fear trees. They ignored the fact that their composite bows, which relied on organic glues, were becoming sluggish in the humid river air. They ignored the fact that their horses were tired. They were fixated on the fleeing Bulgars ahead of them. It is a phenomenon known as target fixation. When a pilot becomes so focused on the thing he is trying to kill that he flies his plane into the ground. Subutai was fixated. He wanted to catch this insolent King Chelba and make an example of him. As they entered the deepest part of the Samara Bend, the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, distorted shadows across the path. The silence returned, heavier than before. No birds, no wind, just the sound of 20,000 horses churning the mud. They were now fully inside the throat of the beast. The river was behind them and to their left. The mountains were to their right. The trap was physically closed, but the psychological trigger hadn't been pulled yet. Subutai rode at the front, eyes scanning the gloom, perhaps finally feeling that first, cold prickle of instinct, warning him that something was wrong. But by then, it was far too late to turn around. The transition from hunter to prey happens in a heartbeat. One moment, the Mongols were chasing a disorganized rabble of fleeing Bulgars. The next, the rabble stopped. They didn't slow down, they simply planted their feet in the mud, turned around, and lowered their spears. At the exact same instant, the forest on either side of the Mongol column erupted. It wasn't a charge, it was a collapsing wall of humanity. Thousands of Bulgar infantry, who had been lying prone in the undergrowth for hours, stood up. They were so close that the Mongols could smell the sweat on them. This is the nightmare scenario for a steppe army. The Mongol military machine was built on space. It required distance to maneuver, to retreat, to cycle fresh horses into the front line. But here, in the suffocating embrace of the Samara Bend, there was no space. The Mongol column, stretched out for miles, was suddenly compressed from three sides. The fleeing Bulgars at the front, the bait, became the anvil. The soldiers emerging from the trees were the hammer. Subutai, watching from his command post, would have realized his mistake instantly. He tried to signal his flanks to wheel outward, to engage the new threat. But you cannot wheel a horse in a dense thicket of oak trees. You cannot fire a composite bow effectively when the enemy is 5 feet away and swinging a battle axe at your horse's legs. The Mongol bow, the weapon that had conquered half the world, was suddenly useless. It was a long-range instrument designed for the open plains. In the claustrophobic gloom of the forest, there were no targets, only a chaotic mass of screaming men and dying animals. The Bulgars didn't fight like the Europeans. They didn't look for honorable duels. They understood the physics of the ambush. They targeted the horses first. They used long, hooked polearms to drag the Mongols out of their saddles. A Mongol on a horse is a god of war. A Mongol on the ground, wearing heavy lamellar armor in knee-deep mud, is just a slow, terrified man trying to stand up. The forest floor quickly turned into a slurry of blood and dirt, stripping away the Mongols' agility. Then came the second phase of the trap. As the Mongols tried to pull back, to reverse out of the kill zone, they ran into the forgotten wall. The retreat path they thought was open had been sealed by the heavy infantry Jebe had hidden in the rear. The noose was complete. The panic that ensued wasn't just fear, it was a total cognitive collapse. These were men who had never known defeat. They didn't have a mental framework for losing. When the order and discipline broke down, it didn't devolve into a fighting retreat. It devolved into a riot. The noise must have been deafening. In an open field, sound dissipates. In a forest, it echoes. The screams of horses, the crunch of bone, and the roar of the ambush were trapped under the canopy, creating a disorienting wall of noise that made commanding impossible. Subutai's flags couldn't be seen, his drums couldn't be heard. The great general, the man who moved armies like chess pieces, was suddenly just a spectator to his own destruction. He watched as his elite heavy lancers, the men who had crushed the Rus at Kalka, were pulled down and butchered like cattle in a pen. The strategic genius of the Mongols had been nullified by the simple, brutal reality of geography. They weren't fighting an army anymore, they were fighting the land itself, and the land was winning. If you want to understand the true horror of medieval warfare, you have to strip away the Hollywood choreography. There were no duelists dancing on the edge of a cliff. There was no room for skill. In the center of the Samara Bend, the compression of bodies was so intense that men were dying of asphyxiation before they were even touched by a weapon. The Mongol army, 20,000 strong, had been squeezed into a killing jar that was physically too small to hold them. As the Bulgar heavy infantry closed the ring, the slaughter began in earnest. It was industrial. The Bulgars didn't just hack at the enemy, they dismantled them. They used long-handled axes and billhooks, weapons designed to crack open heavy armor like crab shells. A Mongol warrior, terrifying on the open steppe with his speed and reach, was defenseless here. He was trapped on a panicked horse, surrounded by trees that blocked his swing, while men on the ground hooked his legs and dragged him into the mud. Once he was down, it was over. The mud of the Volga region is deep and adhesive. A fallen rider didn't just fall, he vanished into the slurry, trampled by his own comrades, before a Bulgar dagger could even find his throat. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For 20 years, the Mongols had been the ones inflicting this kind of terror. They were the ones who encircled, who squeezed, who executed. Now the roles were reversed with a sickening irony. The invincibility of the Golden Horde evaporated. It turns out that when you strip a Mongol of his horse and his bow, he bleeds just like a Russian peasant. He screams just like a Khwarezmian citizen. The myth of their godhood was being butchered in real time, right in front of Subutai's eyes. The rear of the Mongol column tried to push forward to escape the forgotten wall, while the front tried to push back to escape the ambush. The result was a crush in the center, where horses reared up and crushed their riders, and men trampled each other in a desperate bid for oxygen. The Bulgars simply tightened the circle, stepping over the piles of dead to get to the living. The river water began to change color, turning from a murky brown to a vivid, oxygenated red as thousands of men were pushed back into the Volga. This wasn't war, it was a meat grinder. The Bulgars were fighting with a cold, methodical hatred. They knew who these men were, they knew what they had done to the Rus, and they weren't interested in taking prisoners for ransom, at least not yet. They were interested in extermination. The air was thick with the copper smell of blood and the bowels of dying animals. Subutai, the genius tactician, watched his world collapse. There were no orders left to give. Flank left means nothing when your left flank is a wall of corpses. Charge means nothing when your horse is knee-deep in intestines. The greatest army on earth was being digested by the forest. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a battlefield when the momentum shifts irreversibly. It is the moment when an army realizes that victory is no longer on the table and the new objective is simply survival. For the Mongols at Samara Bend, that realization didn't come as a tactical update. It came as a visceral shock. You have to remember who was dying in this mud. These weren't conscripts dragged from a farm in Mongolia a few weeks ago. These were the Keshig, the Imperial Guard, the veterans of the Khwarezmian campaign, men who had ridden across the roof of the world. Each one of them was a repository of 10 years of warfare. They knew how to siege Chinese cities, how to navigate the Gobi Desert, and how to survive the Russian winter. And now they were being poked to death by peasants with sharp sticks in a dark forest 4,000 miles from home. The cost of the Battle of Samara Bend wasn't just in bodies, it was in institutional memory. Subutai was watching his veterans being erased. This is the price of immortality. The Mongols had built a myth that they were ghosts, demons, unstoppable forces of nature. But ghosts don't scream when they are gutted. Demons don't beg for mercy in a language no one understands. As the Bulgar ring tightened, the Mongol soldiers were stripped of their mythology and revealed to be just men, fragile, breakable, and terrified. Subutai, trapped in the center of the collapse, had to make the hardest decision a commander can make. He had to decide who would die so that he could live. There is no chivalry in this calculation. It is pure, cold math. He gathered the remnants of his vanguard, the men who still had horses and weapons, and he used the mass of his own panic-stricken infantry as a human shield. He didn't try to save the army. He sacrificed the army to save the command structure. He ordered a concentrated, suicidal charge, not at the enemy, but through a weak point in the encirclement. It was a breakout, but it looked more like an amputation. To get Subutai and Jebe out of the trap, thousands of Mongols had to stay behind to clog the blades of the Bulgar axes. They were the friction that bought the generals a few seconds of distance. History estimates that out of the 20,000 to 25,000 men who entered the Samara Bend, only a fraction made it out. Some sources say 4,000, others say even less. The rest were not just killed, they were humiliated. The Bulgars didn't just want them dead, they wanted to send a message to the rest of the world that the wrath of God bleeds. There is a local legend, sometimes debated but thematically perfect, known as the Ram Battle. It suggests that the Bulgars captured so many Mongols that they offered to trade them back for rams, one Mongol for one sheep. Whether literally true or a piece of propaganda, it encapsulates the sheer depth of the disgrace. The masters of the world were reduced to currency, traded for livestock. The survivors who broke out with Subutai didn't look like conquerors. They were stripped of their armor, their loot, and their dignity. They were wounded, starving, and running south with the desperate speed of men who know the devil is snapping at their heels. The invincible horde had been broken, not by a greater empire, but by a smart king who knew how to use a river and a forest to turn a wolf pack into a flock of sheep. The remnant that crawled out of the Volga forests didn't look like an army, it looked like a funeral procession for the idea of Mongol invincibility. Subutai and Jebe, the two most feared men on earth, were now leading a column of ghosts. They had lost their loot, they had lost their heavy cavalry, they had lost the aura of supernatural terror that had been their greatest weapon. They were hemorrhaging men to infection and starvation with every mile they rode south toward the safety of the Caspian steppes. Somewhere in that long, miserable retreat, the partnership that had burned down half the world came to an end. History is hazy on the exact details, but it is generally accepted that Jebe, the arrow, died shortly after the disaster at Samara Bend. Maybe it was a fever, maybe it was a Bulgar arrow festering in a wound he was too proud to bandage. But the result was the same. Subutai was now alone. The dynamic duo was broken. The man who had been the hammer to Jebe's anvil was left to carry the weight of the greatest defeat in Mongol history back to Genghis Khan. Usually, when a Mongol general lost an army, he was executed. Failure was a capital offense. But Subutai was different. When he finally limped back to the main horde, he didn't offer excuses, he offered data. He laid out the autopsy of the battle. He explained how the forests neutralized the composite bow. He explained how the heavy cavalry became a liability in the mud. He explained the fortifications and the ambush tactics of the Bulgars. This is the moment where Subutai transformed from a great general into a terrifying one. Most men would have been broken by Samara Bend. They would have developed a fear of the forests. Subutai did the opposite. He became obsessed. He realized that the Mongol way of war, the reliance on speed and terror, had a hard limit. Against a disciplined enemy in difficult terrain, shock and awe wasn't enough. You needed engineering, you needed intelligence, you needed a slow, grinding, methodical approach that left nothing to chance. The Subutai that emerged from the Volga was a different animal. The dog of war had been put down, and in its place rose the limping wolf. He didn't want to just go back and fight the Bulgars again, he wanted to solve them. He spent the next decade planning his return. He didn't just train soldiers, he built the most sophisticated spy network the medieval world had ever seen. He sent merchants and travelers into Volga, Bulgaria with specific instructions: count the bridges, measure the depth of the rivers, map the trade routes, and find the names of every local lord who could be bribed or blackmailed. He treated the entire nation of Volga, Bulgaria not as an enemy, but as a math problem that he had gotten wrong on the first try. He was going to spend the rest of his life making sure that when he took the test again, he would get a perfect score. The Bulgars celebrated their victory. They thought they had saved their civilization. They didn't realize that by defeating Subutai, they hadn't driven him away. They had simply given him an education. They had taken a dangerous man and forced him to become perfect. And as the years passed, while the Bulgars returned to their trade and their river life, Subutai sat in the east, sharpening his mind, waiting for the order to march, and promising himself that next time he wouldn't bring an army, he would bring an apocalypse. In the end, the Battle of Samara Bend stands as a monument to one of the rarest events in history. A moment when the unstoppable force of the Mongol Empire hit an immovable object and shattered. For the Volga Bulgars, it was their finest hour. They had done what the Shah of Khwarezm, the princes of Georgia, and the knights of the Rus could not do. They had looked the devil in the eye and made him blink. For a few brief years the trade routes remained open, the cities of Bulgar and Bilar flourished, and the people slept soundly believing they had proven that the Mongols were mortal. But history has a cruel sense of humor. The tragedy of the Volga Bulgars is not that they lost, it is that they won the wrong battle. By humiliating Subutai, they didn't deter him, they radicalized him, they stripped away his arrogance and replaced it with a cold, mechanical desire for perfection. If the Bulgars had simply paid tribute in 1223, they might have survived as a vassal state. But by destroying an army of the Golden Horde, they guaranteed their own erasure. When the Mongols returned in 1236, 13 years later, it wasn't a raid, it was an extermination. Subutai led the vanguard, but this time he didn't chase feigned retreats, he didn't ride blindly into forests. He brought 150,000 men, he brought Chinese siege engineers, he brought a map of every river crossing and every fortification drawn from the memories of his defeat. The campaign was surgical. The forgotten wall was breached not by cavalry charges but by heavy artillery. The cities were burned so thoroughly that archaeologists today still struggle to distinguish the layers of ash. The population was decimated to the point that the distinct ethnic identity of the Volga Bulgars was largely absorbed into the Golden Horde. They won the battle for the Samara Bend, but they paid for it with their existence. This is the dark lesson of 1223. Tactical brilliance can win you a day, but strategic adaptation wins the century. Subutai learned from his failure. The Bulgars, confident in their victory, failed to prepare for a different kind of war. They are a reminder that in the game of empires, the most dangerous enemy is not the one who never loses, but the one who loses once, learns why, and swears never to let it happen again. If you found this deep dive into the one defeat that created the perfect general fascinating, you need to see what happened next. The lessons Subutai learned in these forests were the exact blueprints he used to destroy the Knights of Europe a few years later. Click the video on your screen right now to witness the Battle of Mohi, where Subutai takes his Master of the Forest education and applies it to the Kingdom of Hungary with terrifying results. And before you go, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. Do you think the Bulgars should have negotiated, or is it better to die on your feet than live on your knees, even if it means the end of your civilization? I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next part of history.